Today, let's talk about what I look for when creating double drops for my sets and my mixes. Double dropping is a pretty common technique in DJing and especially in bass music that refers to playing two drops from two different songs at the same time without it sounding like an absolute mess. And they're a great way to add excitement and increase intensity in your sets and play something the crowd's never heard before, and even using popular songs that people have heard and recognize, but not just playing a song that everyone else has heard. So some artists are well known for doing this a lot, and some artists almost never do it, but everyone who does has a different method for it, and in this video I'm going to show you some of the techniques that I use for finding and executing some good sounding doubles. I did do an hour-long multi-genre mix entirely of doubles, which can be found below if you're interested in listening to how some of these concepts work. And I do want to point out, before we begin, one last thing. I'm going to list a whole bunch of things to look for in terms of songs that might sound good in a double, but I want to make sure to acknowledge that you do not need all of these. You just might want to look for them and pay attention, and if you see some of these, then maybe it's a good idea to start messing with doubles for that song. But just because a double doesn't fit all of the rules or all the things that I'm going to talk about doesn't mean that it doesn't work or that it's bad. As with almost everything that I talk about, there's a good way to break these rules out there somewhere, whether I know it or not. So whatever sounds good to you is ultimately what you should be doing. I'm going to be mostly focusing on high energy doubles, especially dubstep and drum and bass, because that's my specialty and that's what I know the most, but I use these same techniques to create doubles in house and down-tempo and lo-fi and experimental, so just play around with it. Use these as more guidelines than rules. Okay, I think that's enough intro. Let's get to the actual part where we talk about doubles. One of the first things that I think about when I'm trying to find songs that might double well is, are they recognizable? Now, personally, I really like doing doubles where if you know the songs individually, you could still identify them while you're listening. So as I'm sifting through new music and trying to find songs that I want to play in new sets, I look for things that have identifiable elements like melodies or sound design that's very unique, and that I think I might be able to use in a double without covering that element up. A really, really good example of this is Big Boss by Dr. P. It sounds like this. Luckily, I don't use ads in my videos or that would have already been demonetized by now. But you hear how distinctive the melody is in Big Boss. You could easily put something like quarter notes behind it and you can still hear the melody and know exactly what's playing and you know that it's Big Boss. So, for example, you can do this double. On top of being a really recognizable melody, another thing that Big Boss offers that can help us is the frequency of the important parts. So when you're playing two songs at once, not only is it going to be louder, it's around 3 decibels louder. If you want to know more about that, go watch my video on decibels up there. But you're also going to have twice as many noises going on as if you were just playing one track, obviously. But this can become super messy and hard to listen to. One of the ways that we can handle this is with EQ. And if you're new to doubling, please pay attention to this section because this is the number one thing that will make your doubles come through much cleaner that I do not see people who are new doing nearly enough, if at all. A lot of people don't know about this or they just think it's not necessary or they don't do it. This will help you immensely. So, most people will tell you that when you're playing two songs at once, you don't want to play the low end from both because the bass will almost certainly interfere with each other. It'll cause a warbly, weak, muddy low end and it'll be gross, which is totally true. Low frequencies of the same amplitude carry a lot of acoustical energy, and because the wavelengths are so much longer, they're also more susceptible to things like audio phasing. So a lot of people will tell you that. However, advice that I rarely see go around or rarely see people talking about is using the mid and the high EQ knobs to tweak how much of each band you're getting in a double. Increase the EQ to highlight certain parts of a song that you definitely want the audience to hear, and decrease the EQ on other songs or other parts of the other song to make space in the frequency range for the parts that you do want to hear. If you're a producer, you're probably familiar with the idea of carving out some frequency space out of some sounds with an EQ to make room for another instrument to come through from something else. This is exactly the same technique. For example, if I double Die by Crimer and Circle Pit by Virus Syndicate with no EQing, it'll sound like this. It's not bad, but the mid-range is kind of getting overcrowded, and looking at it, you don't really need the mids from Circle Pit to get the choppy effect, and that's kind of the point of what I'm trying to get out of Circle Pit. So, if I play this again, but I take some of the mids out of Circle Pit, and I lower the highs slightly on Die to make some extra room for the high-end choppiness in Circle Pit, you get a much cleaner sound, and it'll sound like this. Not only do both of the elements that I wanted to highlight come through cleaner, but it almost sounds like they were made to be played together like this. There's a lot more space in the track. Oftentimes, you can get two songs to sound pretty good with the standard 3-band EQ on a DJM mixer or on a controller, but if you can't quite get the sound you want, or it's still a little bit too messy, and you want just that little bit of extra control, what I do is often make edits in Ableton of songs so that I can do more precise EQing, and I'll go over that more later and I'll talk about it. Using EQ can be very helpful in reducing this frequency crowding and making elements sound stronger in your doubles, but there are some pitfalls to watch out for. The number one issue that I see people run into while they're doing this is they're playing a double, and they're playing both songs, and they have some EQ editing, and then they cut one song out for a second and just play the other song to highlight a little bit. Maybe it's a vocal or something in the other track that they wanted to come through, but they forget to turn the EQ back to normal while they cut the other song out. I'm going to go more over this issue, but just keep in mind that that's something you have to look out for. Synth patterns are super, super important to double drops as well. The rhythms of the elements that you want to be heard need to be compatible. Notice that I didn't say they need to be the same, they need to be compatible. I guess need is a strong word, but want to be compatible. To restate what I said in the intro, everything can be done improperly, quote unquote, and still sound good, so play with it a little bit. But that being said, if you're just learning to double, I would stick to this rule as much as you can over the others, as this is about the quickest and easiest way to make a messy double, aside from forgetting to beat match. The two patterns can definitely be the same. You can have quarter notes on top of quarter notes, or triplets on top of triplets, but what you should avoid, if possible, is mixing patterns that create an uneven amount of space between the notes. So here's a sort of visual representation of what I mean by this. If this is 4 beats, here where the quarter notes land on song A, and here is where the quarter notes would land on song B. Obviously the patterns are the same, the notes line up, and the gaps between them are the same distance. Now if I make track B play half notes, the patterns aren't the same, but the gap between each new note is still the same. But here's where it gets tricky. If we have quarter note triplets in track A, this configuration works as all the gaps are the same size, and then quarter note triplets over quarter notes is an issue. If you look here, we have the quarter note triplets, we have our quarter notes on top, and now our gaps between each note are not the same size. You have these small gaps here, and then these larger gaps over here, and playing two different non-complementary patterns can be kind of disorienting, in addition to all the new frequencies and the extra layer of drums going on, so that can create a really messy sound. One other thing to watch out for is when synth patterns could be the same, but some notes are delayed or swung. A lot of songs will have synths hitting slightly after the drums instead of right on the beat grids, and this can sound really, really cool on its own, but it can also make them sound like they aren't lined up right. For example, if you listen to Buster Island by Moody Good, the synths seem to land slightly later than the drums. Take a listen to this. If you stack this with a song that has the synths in time with the drums, it's going to very quickly sound like the songs aren't lined up right, because either the drums are in time and the synths aren't, or you pull it over and the synths are in time, but then the drums aren't. The other type of patterns that are important to look at are the drum patterns, and mostly what you want to be watching out for this is the kick and the snare. Those are the really important ones. Ideally, you can get the kick and the snare to hit at the same time, so they kind of stack and they mask each other, and it sounds like one set of kicks and one set of snares. It's not always possible, especially in genres that have more complex drums, like drum and bass. For that, my advice is to honestly just listen to them together and just pay attention to the kick and snare and make sure that you can feel a pretty consistent pulse throughout it. And if you can feel it, then it'll be danceable. Let us also talk briefly about mixing in key. This is going to be a brief overview. Mixing in key very much depends on the songs in particular. If you're mixing mostly atonal sounds and cutting out the bass of one song, then two songs that aren't in compatible keys can totally work. So just use your best judgment, use your ears, listen to it, and see if it sounds good. But on the other hand, if two songs seem like they should be working, but it just isn't sitting right and you can't figure out why, it's quite possible that key is the culprit. And luckily, if you find a double and you really want to play it, but the key is the issue, it's not hard to shift one or both of the songs and just transpose them so that they sound right. Just figure out what key the track is in and what key it needs to be compatible, and then you can use any DAW or even Audacity, which is free, to change the pitch of a song and put it into the right key. Save a new file and put something in the title to remind yourself that this is not the original version, it's a key-changed version, and then you're good to go. You can do your double. Of course, if you are going to do this, you'll probably get better quality out of it if you use a lossless file like a WAV or a FLAC rather than an MP3 if you're transposing. More info about that in that video. Earlier I mentioned that during a double, sometimes you can cut back to just one song to highlight a single element out of that song and then go back to the double. There are a lot of ways you can use this to enhance doubles. You can silence brief parts that don't quite work together, that's good. You can play vocals in the middle of a drop that a lot of people will recognize and then bring the whole double drop back in. One big thing to remember is if you do cut back down to one song, just bring the EQ back to center so that it sounds full on its own. For example, Chop Chop by Virtual Riot has great little tags and vocals all through the entire drop, but if you play both drops, then a lot of the synths can overrun these vocals and you can't hear them so well. So if I'm ever doubling with that, I will take the other song out, play the vocals, and then bring it back in. When I do this, I make sure that if I took the bass out of Chop Chop for the double, I put the bass back up when I'm doing just the vocal. Otherwise, the vocals sound kind of tinny and not as intense and serious as you would want them to, especially right in the middle of a high-energy double. Something else I look at is the overall breaks in the track in question. If one track has major breaks, then you'll want to plan for that either by pairing it with another song that has the same kind of breaks or planning to cut to just the other song in that part of the double. So a very good example of this is Chaos by Must Die. In Chaos, there are those really long regular sections that are just horns, and then the drop comes back, and then just horns, and the drop comes back. You gotta plan for that. Are you playing both tracks, or are you just playing the horns, or are you just playing the other part during that? Make sure that you have an idea of what you want to do there. And this is where you start to ride the line between doubles and chopping is a whole different video that I'll do at some point. But just make sure that you know if you're going to be cutting a song out, fix the EQ and know when and where you need to cut it out before you go into the double, because you'll get yourself in trouble pretty quickly. Okay, that seems like a lot of requirements, and maybe it sounds like you'll never find tracks that work together and fit all these requirements, but that's the nice thing about music, and especially dance music, is that it's very predictable. It follows very set patterns. All songs in a given genre are likely to share some qualities just because those qualities define that genre, and that's what people who listen to that genre like to hear. And beyond that, songs in your particular library are even more likely to be similar because all of the songs in your library have something about them that you like. So, of course, like I said at the top, you don't have to fit all of these properties to make a good double, but don't let the long list intimidate you. You probably have a lot of songs that work really well in your library already, you just haven't thought about it yet. Once you've found a song that you think might be a good candidate for a double, give a scroll through your library and see if anything jumps out at you as a good option to pair with it. Knowing your music really well goes a long way here to coming up with ideas very quickly. I like to pick two songs that I think might work well and play them on top of each other from about 32 bars before the drop, just to see if they would work well as layered build-ups or if I should just wait until the drop to layer them both. If they work, I make a note for myself somewhere, I have a note here, and then I keep looking. I like to find multiple options for each song, that way I can play it multiple times across multiple different sets and not have to repeat myself, because I don't like playing the same thing if somebody comes to see me twice or 3 times, even within a few months span, and then A, they know what's coming and that's not as exciting for them, and B, there's so many cool things you can do that why would you limit yourself to just doing the one thing over and over again? Do this enough times and you'll really get a feel for what works and what doesn't work, and eventually you'll be able to come up with ideas for doubles on the fly while you're mixing live. You'll play a song and you'll go, oh, I just downloaded that new tune from that other guy and that has a kind of similar pattern, let me do that, and you can just do it on the spot. Sometimes you might find that doubles work sort of, but they need some editing that you can't do live either, and for that you can make edits. And generally speaking, I don't personally like to make edits that are a single file with both tracks baked in. 2 reasons for that. 1, I prefer the feeling of mixing it live, it's just part of the enjoyment for me. And 2, because it limits the ways that you can mix that double. It takes all of your options away once you export it, and you just have the one way that you can do that double, and it takes away all of your control. So I personally like to make my changes, whether it's EQ changes or I'm making certain sections longer or shorter so that they match in both songs, whatever I need to do, and then I export both songs separately with their individual changes. That way, I A, still get to mix them on stage as I originally intended, and it's more fun for me, and B, I can combine them in other ways with other songs and make new doubles out of those edited double songs that I've already made. I'll do a video on edits eventually, and I'll talk about how I do this and show some examples, but in general, that's how I like to do edits. You definitely don't have to do it that way at all. Let's talk about when to use double drops. In this section, I'm referring mostly to high energy doubles with modern dubstep or drum and bass. And this is the opinion part of the video, so I know that people are going to disagree with me, but I've been around a long time, and most of the established artists that I've talked to have similar opinions on this that I do. You shouldn't be using doubles all the time, at least not in a live setting. And I know I did start this video off plugging a mix that I did called Double Damage that is an hour long and straight doubles, but I would never do that live. That mix is more of a showcase than anything. That many doubles in a row at a show would be exhausting to most of the audience. And in a live setting where it's hot and people are dancing and sweating and not taking breaks for water, you need breathers in between those sections of maximum intensity. Even the artists that double the most leave some gaps of single tracks in, and to be honest, some songs are just better enjoyed on their own. The minimalism and the push and the pull of some emptier songs might lend themselves to very clean doubles that could be technically impressive, but sometimes they still sound better on their own. And on top of that, if you're supporting a headliner, you don't want to blow up the spot as hard as you can, so being selective and careful with your double placement can keep the crowd engaged and ready and excited, and also keep you in good standing with both the company that booked you and the person playing after you. In my opinion, for live shows, it's better to sprinkle in some doubles when the time and the energy are just right, and you want to bring it all the way up to a 10, and then dial it back down to an 8, and then bring it back up to a 10 again later. Keep people on the edge of their seat. Again, I'm specifically talking about high energy doubles here. You could get away with lower energy doubles like deep dub or anything like that for an entire set possibly, and it wouldn't be too much. Triples exist as well, and triples are exactly what you expect. It's 3 songs at the same time. And triples can sound very cool sometimes, but you have to be really, really careful with them because all of the dangers that we've been trying to avoid this entire video with doubles and trying not to create noisy messes that are undanceable are even more present when you add a 3rd song into the mix. I recommend using triples rarely and with simple songs and a generous use of the EQ to lower and cut some frequencies so that you can still hear what's going on. And quad drops exist as well, but if you need this video, then you're not ready for quad drops yet. So write it on a sticky note, put it on your wall, and in 6 months after you've practiced some doubles, come back and take a look at triples and quad drops later on. Double dropping can add a massive amount of excitement and energy to your sets, but it's important that you do it right, otherwise you'll make a loud, annoying mess on stage that's hard to listen to and let alone dance to. Everyone will be standing around waiting for you to transition out of it, and then later somebody will come up with a video and be like, "What was this?" Okay, they probably won't actually do that, but you don't want to do it anyway. If you only learn one thing from this entire video, make sure that it's this. When you're mixing, and especially, and I cannot emphasize this enough, especially when you're double dropping, things are going to sound so much better to you than they are to the listener. And you're not going to notice exactly what they sound like because you're so focused on what you're doing and trying to make it sound good and where you're going to go next with it that you're not getting the full listening experience from your side of the table. That's why I always recommend recording a practice mix with some doubles in it and whatever other tricks you've been working on, and listen to it in your car or in the living room. It'll become very, very quickly apparent what works and what doesn't, and what you need to improve on still to make it sound the way you thought it sounded when you were actually doing it. Then you can go back, you can work on those, you can fix those things, make a new mix, and then go listen to it in the car, listen to it in the living room. Do this a few times before you take any doubles to the stage, and you'll actually be ready to impress some people instead of thinking that it might have been an accident. I talk more about this technique a little bit in my video on time management up there, but in brief, listen to things in the car. Don't just listen to things while you're mixing and then go, "That was awesome." Thank you all very much for listening. I hope that you're able to use some of this information to improve your own performance and get one step closer to the kind of artist or performer that you want to be. If you have any more questions about double dropping or anything else, don't be afraid to reach out, drop a comment or a private message, and I will answer as best I can. Thank you.